Hi, and thank you for joining us for this introductory webinar to DIBELS 8th edition. My name is Nancy Nelson. I'm a Research Assistant Professor at the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Patrick and Maureen, who are going to introduce themselves and help us with this webinar today.
Hi, I'm Patrick Kennedy, and I'm a Research Associate at CTL. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of our new and innovative improvements to the measures and our validity and reliability evidence.
Hi, I'm Maureen Warman. I'm a Research Assistant in the College of Education and the DIBELS Data System Manager. I'm going to share information with you that will be helpful as you transition to DIBELS 8th edition.
Our agenda for today for this webinar, we're going to talk about the rationale for releasing a new edition of DIBELS, the uses of DIBELS in multi-tiered systems of support, what's new in DIBELS 8th edition. Patrick will also talk about the research and technical adequacy supporting DIBELS 8th edition, and then Maureen will describe information about how to transition to DIBELS 8th edition. So I'm going to start with a brief description of the rationale for releasing DIBELS 8th edition. And primarily, this is that all educational tools, including assessments, should adhere to the highest standards of technical adequacy. They should also keep pace with rapid changes that are occurring in the field with respect to methodological, statistical, and analytical improvements. There have been a number of changes in education policy and practice that should also be reflected in education tools, including assessments. And because assessments are based on norm data, updates are necessary to ensure that assessments are responding to the increasingly diverse population that exists across the U.S. Educational tools, including assessments, should also incorporate knowledge built through research on effective systems for delivering practices. So with DIBELS 8th edition, we're prioritizing technical adequacy, scientific evidence, being transparent in reporting our results and technical adequacy information, and we're engaged in ensuring that we have independent reviews of the quality and utility of DIBELS 8th edition so that schools and districts are able to make informed decisions about the educational tools and assessments that they're using. When we talk about improvement in testing standards, we're talking primarily about the standards for educational and psychological testing, which are jointly produced by the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education, who together put out these standards that are continuously updated over time and inform us about the necessary features of assessments and tools that should be used in schools for database decision making. So in our case, we're referencing these standards and making sure that DIBELS 8th edition is meeting current analytical and methodological standards for such assessment measures. As I mentioned, we're also engaged in ensuring there's independent review of DIBELS 8th edition to support your informed decision-making about the quality of DIBELS 8th edition and your choice to adopt it as a measure. So one example of an independent review process is the one used by the National Center on Intensive Interventions. We are currently in the process of submitting DIBELS 8th edition to NCII to ensure that you're informed, again, about the evidence behind DIBELS 8th edition. What Works Clearinghouse is another example of an entity that independently reviews a variety of educational tools and products. Assessments should also reflect changes in learning standards and initiatives, which is another reason that we're updating DIBELS to DIBELS 8th edition. So for example, in the last decade, the Common Core State Standards came out, which your state might use. And a number of states have initiatives that drive the way that we're thinking about the importance of reading. So there are a number of states that have third grade reading initiatives. For example, Michigan's Top 10 in 10 Years initiative is another example of different initiatives that are currently underway that affect the way that we think about assessments and their uses. Another major example of the way that we need to consider our assessments for keeping pace with changes in national and state priorities is the prevalence of dyslexia legislation. So approximately 40 states across the U.S. have passed some form of dyslexia legislation in the last several years, and that's definitely influencing practice. So we see in some states that have adopted this legislation, there's new rules around the requirements for screening. In other cases, it's requirements for interventions or both. So we have we've taken that to heart, and we've been engaged in a validation study of DIBELS 8th edition for dyslexia specifically. So we would say that DIBELS 8th edition has been developed and validated as a screening tool for dyslexia, and we've done that in a couple of ways in our research. So for one, we've developed new measures for assessing constructs that are related to dyslexia, including the word reading fluency measure. And we've also revised existing measures to better align with dyslexia theory and research, and that includes the letter naming fluency measure and also nonsense word fluency. In multi-tiered systems of support and other school-wide approaches, we know that school assessments are an integral part of such complex systems. And in those systems, DIBELS 8th edition will continue to be used to screen students for reading difficulty and risk for not meeting grade level expectations, for monitoring student progress across the year at and between benchmark periods, so fall, winter, and spring, but also between those benchmark periods, with some increased technical adequacy evidence for the stability of progress monitoring. DIBELS 8th edition measures are also better equipped to inform basic knowledge of student error patterns to guide decisions about instruction. And so the way that the measures have been constructed support teachers to better use the measures and the content of the measures to support an understanding of what students are able to do and what they're not able to do. And they also help to assess the health of the system for meeting students' instructional needs. So consistent with previous versions of DIBELS, we have reporting functions that support school systems to be able to evaluate whether or not the majority of students are on track to meet grade level expectations and whether or not progress is being made within the system to support the same level of attainment. Across the board, we want to make sure that you recognize that we agree that the use of any student assessment approach should be linked to evidence of improved student outcomes. And that is that data should always be used in purposeful, appropriate ways based on how the measures have been validated, and that the data are used to adjust student supports in ways that lead to student success. Now I'm going to turn it over to Patrick, who's going to describe the differences between DIBELS 8th edition and previous versions of DIBELS, and then move on to talk about the technical adequacy evidence behind DIBELS 8th edition.
Thanks, Nancy. And thanks, everybody, for attending today. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk with you about DIBELS 8th edition and specifically go through in some detail what some of our exciting new changes are to make DIBELS 8th edition more comprehensive and better than ever before. So as we've sort of talked about briefly, but as we're going to get into a lot of more detail here today, DIBELS 8 is both more comprehensive than anything we've done before, but it also refines some key features from previous versions of DIBELS to make DIBELS 8 the best tool we've ever released for identifying students in need of instructional support and making decisions about what kind of support those students need. So when I say that DIBELS 8 is more comprehensive than any previous version of DIBELS, what I mean by that is that we have both more grades available across the system, and we've also got more new measures than we've ever had before. All of the measures are now available from kindergarten through grade 8, whereas previous versions of DIBELS only went through 6th grade. And we also have a new word reading fluency measure that we've never had. And it's important to keep in mind as we go through each of the measures here in just a minute that all of the changes that I'm going to describe to you and all of the revisions we've made, they're all based on a rigorous and comprehensive review of the latest research about good measurement development and specifically formative assessment development. So we've utilized both an innovative test construction methodology, and I'll tell you more in just a minute what that looks like, and also some advances in how you go about scoring the measures that, again, make DIBELS 8 better than any previous version of DIBELS. And as you'll see, we've also used this focus and emphasis on research in everything that we've done, everything from our decisions about which measures to offer, what grades to offer them in, all the way through the content that you see on each of the measures, and even down to the formatting and font choices that we've made. They're all based on our review of research about best practices. So it's important to remember as I'm going through each of these changes that we didn't just make them because they seemed like a good idea, but they're all based on research that suggests these are the kinds of things that we need to attend to as we're developing measures and that help us get the best estimate possible of students' reading ability. And we also focused as much as we could on making DIBELS 8th edition more flexible. And what I mean when I say that is that previous versions of DIBELS have always done a good job of identifying those students who are at risk and helping you monitor their progress on essential and critical reading skills. But some of the changes that we've made in terms of the test, how the tests are put together, were done intentionally in a way so that we can provide you with more useful information about students who are actually on track. And as you'll see as I go through each of the measures, what that does is it allows you to say, for a student who, for instance, is above the benchmark goal on all of the subtests, you might say, well, why would I need to continue to monitor this student? And you don't need to monitor them as often, certainly, progress monitor them, but you still want to continue to give those benchmark measures to make sure they're continuing to be on track. And as long as you're investing the time to do that, you may as well have information about where that student's instructional targets are and allow you to tailor their instruction to those needs. And by flexible, we also mean flexibility in terms of how you use the measures. And so we've worked with our online partner, Amplify, to make sure that you can take or administer the DIBELS 8th edition measures, both paper pencil, as other versions of DIBELS traditionally have been, but also these measures can be administered online, which provides a number of useful advantages above and beyond what you can do with paper and pencil. So just a little bit more about what I mean when I say comprehensive. This is a visual indication of where we've made changes and improvements. This is also available on our website, but as you can see along the bottom of the slide here, we have time points all the way from the beginning of kindergarten on the left-hand side up through the end of 8th grade on the right. And each of the measures that are available as part of DIBELS 8th edition are shown as a green bar with their name attached to them. And we've highlighted in yellow areas of sections of time, grade points, where measures are newly available, where they weren't available before. And also, as I mentioned, for the word reading fluency measure, which is all new, that entire bar is highlighted in yellow. So you can see that every measure is available at more time points than it was previously. Some measures, that extension has gone further than others, but for letter naming fluency, you can now administer that measure not just through the beginning of first grade, but all the way through the end of first grade. We also offer a version of phoneme segmentation fluency at the beginning of kindergarten. And as I'll show you when we get to talking about each of these measures individually, we'll show you what we've done to ensure that administering the measures at these additional time points still gives you useful information for kids. Nonsense word fluency was extended both down and up, so down all the way to the beginning of kindergarten and up all the way through the end of 3rd grade. And this nonsense word fluency was probably the measure that changed the most, as you might expect for a measure that was adapted to cover such a much larger age range. And we'll get into what that actually looks like in just a minute. And as you can see, oral reading fluency is now available from the beginning of 1st grade through the end of 8th grade. And the maze measure is available now starting at the beginning of 2nd grade rather than the beginning of 3rd and extending up through the end of 8th grade. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on each of the measures. And as I go through them, I want you to keep in mind sort of this guiding principle that we had in our minds as we went through the process of developing these measures. And really what it boils down to is we recognize that one of the key features and important points about DIBELS is that it's an efficient way to get a good sense of where kids stand instructionally. And so we wanted to be sure that we maintained that efficiency. Any changes we made, we didn't want to make them less efficient, certainly. And we wanted to maintain the strong psychometric properties that previous versions of DIBELS have had, and in some cases even improve on those. But we wanted to be sure that we were doing so in a way that allowed us to provide teachers and schools with additional and, importantly, actionable information, again, about the instructional needs of students. And so there were 3 main areas that we focused on as we as we attempted to do this, and we'll go through each of these things for each measure. But first, we looked at the item pool, that is the words or sounds or nonsense words that were included on each measure, and we thought deeply and critically about what items specifically belonged on each measure. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But we also thought carefully about our form design specifications. So as you'll see, where we put items on the forms was informed, again, by research, but also by our desire to allow us to sort of sequentially increase the difficulty to provide instructionally relevant information, again, across the spectrum of students' abilities. And then ultimately, we combined those two things, took our items and our form design specifications and combined them in a way that allowed us to create multiple versions of every form that are comparable and allow you to assess students over time. So first up, letter naming fluency. We want to talk about what's new with that measure. You wouldn't think that a measure that consists of just upper and lowercase letters can really change that much, and in some ways it didn't, but in some important ways it did as well. So for the first grade forms, we included all 52 upper and lowercase letters with 3 exceptions. And it's not because we don't think that those letters are important. Obviously they are. But given that we also recognize that LNF isn't the only way that teachers can assess students' knowledge of letter names, we made these changes, again, as Nancy mentioned, to allow us to better use this measure as a screening tool for dyslexia. And that's why, for something like W, which is the only letter in the English alphabet that has a multisyllabic name, we excluded that letter because it takes 3 times as long to say as any other letter. So on a fluency measure, and one in which we're particularly concerned about students' processing speed, asking them to respond to W actually slows them down in a way that other letters don't. And so we didn't want that to confound our ability to measure other important things. And similarly with the lowercase l, that is easily confused with both an uppercase I and the number 1. And so we have found both for students and assessors that tends to slow people down. And so again, we're concerned in this measure with processing speed and ability to get through the measure. And so we wanted to be sure and exclude those letters that were going to confuse students. And so similarly with the kindergarten forms, we actually used research and data that suggests what the frequency with which each letter appears in printed English. And so we decided that for kindergarten students, again, prioritizing an emphasis on measuring processing speed, that we're only including the 40 most frequently used letters. And again, that's so that their fluency isn't adversely impacted by being asked to read letters that they may not have already been taught. And this is, of course, especially true at the beginning of kindergarten, but even by the end, the priority here is making sure that, one, that students know those letters that they're most likely to encounter, and also to allow us to provide an estimate of processing speed for things like dyslexia screening. So for phoneme segmentation fluency, we used a similar approach in terms of identifying which items we wanted to include on the forms. And by that I mean we looked at data suggesting or identifying word frequency in written English. And so we made decisions about how frequently a word had to appear in order to be included in the item pool for inclusion on the PSF forms. And again, the reason for including only high-frequency words is to help minimize student difficulties related to a lack of familiarity with those words, and also minimize the impact of vocabulary skills on phoneme segmentation fluency ability. And in terms of arranging items onto the forms. What you see here is an example of a DIBELS 8th form, but it comes from somewhere in the middle of a PSF passage or a PSF form. And so what you see is those first few items on every form are words that are the easiest words in the sense that they have the fewest number of phonemes, and those words are also the most frequent. And so as you go up in, as you move down the form, that is, from the top to the bottom, those words towards the bottom are rarer, and they're also more complex. They have a larger number of phonemes. And one of the benefits of arranging the items in this way, whereas previous versions of phoneme segmentation fluency populated items more or less at random, is that this more systematic approach allows you to cut down on the floor effects that we saw with previous versions of phoneme segmentation fluency, meaning that many students, even those that can't fully segment a word, can at least identify the initial sound in a word. And so if we start with just 2 phoneme words, those kids are essentially segmenting because they're identifying the initial phoneme and then the rest of the word. And that allows us to provide more information about skill level, both for students on track because they're able to get through those easier words more quickly and get to the more challenging words, and also for students who aren't on track, is if they're really struggling with even the most simple two phoneme words, then there's no sense asking them to struggle with more complex words. Nonsense word fluency, as I mentioned, is probably the one measure that changed the most because we've extended it all the way through the end of 3rd grade. And it's also the one that the research team and myself in particular are probably most excited about some of the changes that we've made. To begin with, one of the big changes that has long been asked for, that we finally were responsive to, is that the nonsense word fluency forms now only include letter combinations that actually appear in written English. And so if you're familiar with other versions of DIBELS, what you've seen, we had a lot of nonsense words, CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant, nonsense words that ended in things like J, which is a not something that actually occurs in actual English words. And so, again, there's really no sense in assessing their ability to put those letters together to form a word-like pattern that doesn't actually exist. And so this helps to minimize student confusion. That all of the nonsense words that they're being asked to pronounce are patterns that you would actually see in English. The exact combination, of course, don't have meaning, and that's intentional. The purpose behind nonsense word fluency, to avoid distractions about word knowledge and vocabulary. But we've also adjusted our decisions or our process for assigning items to forms. And again, as we saw with phoneme segmentation fluency, what we've done is intentionally designed the forms so that they are arranged from those words that are least difficult to those that are most difficult. And we've accomplished that essentially by increasing the complexity of the spelling patterns. So as I'll show in just a second, we have a sort of a template for which types of spelling patterns can appear where on each form. And those VC, vowel consonant, and CVC words that were made up the entirety of nonsense word fluency in previous versions of DIBELS now appear primarily in the first 5 or so rows. And as you go beyond that, you start to see more complex spelling patterns. And we introduce different spelling patterns at different grade levels. In 1st grade, you move on to words that have a silent E and R controlled vowels. And things get progressively more complex as we move up into 2nd and 3rd grade. And that's actually what allows us to have a useful version of nonsense word fluency beyond 1st grade, is that we're not just assessing these very simple spelling patterns, but that we're actually assessing spelling patterns that students tend to be taught at those grade levels. And again, this is useful because it allows you to get more formative information about which kinds of spelling patterns individual students have mastered. And this is actually true both for students at risk and for students who are on track. This design approach also provides information for assessors about individual phonemes in words. That is, as you can see in the example here, we've actually provided a pronunciation key. And this, of course, makes administration and scoring easier, particularly for those proficient students who read pretty quickly, and so you don't have to stop and think, even if you're not highly familiar with a given form, think about how a nonsense word needs to be pronounced because it's right there for you. And as you can see in the example, the yellow box there is just highlighting some of the more complex spelling patterns that are introduced later in upper grades. So the way in which we actually constructed our item pool for nonsense word fluency is that we used data from Norvig and colleagues on the frequency counts of English letter n-grams. And what that means is just different letter combinations. So single letters, two-letter combinations, etc. on up. And then we used that frequency information to identify how often those combinations of letters appear in written English, and then created a whole bunch of combinations of different letter frequencies and summed them up to get a frequency estimate across the whole, essentially, word or nonsense word, and then looked across the pool of all possible letter combinations to identify quartiles of word frequency and remove those words in the bottom quartile, meaning that those very infrequent combinations aren't assessed. And again, that's a similar approach to what we used on other subtests for DIBELS. And so we ended up with a total item pool of more than 79,000 nonsense words. Of course, not all of those nonsense words appear on every form. They also don't appear, some of them don't appear on any form, and that's fine. We're obviously not trying to assess every possible nonsense word, but we made sure by our item placement rules that we're assessing a sampling of each of these on every form. And of course, forms for earlier grades don't include nonsense words that follow the more complex spelling patterns. But as you can see here is an example of our form design template, which again specifies the specific sequence and relative frequency of each spelling pattern by grade. And all of the forms across grades are arranged in somewhere between 15 to 18 rows of 5 words each. And this table gives you an example for grade 1 specifically of the spelling pattern distributions. As you can see, the first 5 rows are made up entirely of CVC, which again are consonant, vowel, consonant, and VC, or just vowel, consonant words, which previous versions of DIBELS, that was the entire nonsense word fluency task, was just those spelling types. But as you can see now for DIBELS 8th edition, as we move into rows 6 through 9, we continue to have about half of the words on those rows represent CVC and VC words, but we've also started to introduce silent E and R-controlled vowels. And then as you move on to rows 10 through 12 and 13 to 15, we continue to have some representation of those spelling patterns already introduced, but then we also start to introduce more complex blends and even 3-word blends at the end, or sorry, 3-letter blends by the end of the form. And so here is an example of what a nonsense word fluency form in grade 1 might actually look like. Again, of course, these are not actual nonsense words, but they show you sort of what the distribution of spelling pattern types might look like at each time point. And you can see the actual forms that students see and that assessors are scoring on don't have these horizontal bars, but they're provided here to show you where those breakpoints are relative to the table that we just talked about. And you can see where the different spelling patterns start to get introduced and the complexity increases. Importantly, you can see here with the red bracket, The fall grade 1 benchmark goal for nonsense word fluency correct letter sounds is actually right about where this bracket is drawn. And what that shows you is that students who are struggling never actually even get exposed to these more complex spelling patterns. And that's intentional because, if a student can't decode these simple spelling patterns, then again, we're not going to frustrate them by asking them to do things that are more complex. And so what the additional spelling patterns get you is for those students that are beyond the benchmark goal, you get to see to what extent they are familiar with and know these more complex spelling patterns. And so this is an example that I talked about just a minute ago of how these design decisions that we've made for all of the versions of the different subtests, but this is a nice example of it, how those decisions really allow you to get additional information for students that you never could before, and this is particularly true for those students that are beyond the benchmark goal. For word reading fluency, what's new is everything because we've never had a word reading fluency measure before. But the rationale behind providing both word reading fluency and nonsense word fluency is really that the assessment of real words helps us to identify some students who are at risk that we weren't previously able to identify with other DIBELS measures. And I'll show you a graphic in just a minute that really drives this point home. But the point of, or the goal for assessing students on word reading fluency is that we're asking them to read sight words that research suggests most students should know, certainly by the end of the grade level on which the forms appear. And again, the decisions about which items to include was intentional so that we can both minimize our floor effects, that is, minimize the extent to which students don't know any words on the form, and also allow you to get information about student knowledge of words that are commonly taught during instruction. So again, we're only including words on word reading fluency if they are high frequency, that they appear relatively frequently in English, in the English language, in written English, but also that they're words that research suggests are frequently taught during the grade level in which they're introduced. And again, just like all of the other measures that we've talked about to this point, we made the intentional decision to arrange items in increasing order of difficulty. For this subtest, we operationalized difficulty as number of syllables, so that again we're only asking students who are at risk to read words that are, one, very common, and also are words that they really should know. And so as you progress along the form, those students that are on track are going to fly through those easier items, and then you start to get information about their individual word knowledge of more complex and less frequent words. These graphics here show you just sort of a sampling of how the items get more complex over time. We won't go into a lot of detail about those individual items today, though. In terms of how we actually identified words for inclusion on word reading fluency, we started with the familiar Dale and O'Rourke word list, that words with a test-based age of acquisition rating, and that list includes more than 39,000 words. And then we actually pared that list down by applying 4 different criteria. First, we excluded any words where the meaning was known by fewer than 50% of 4th grade students. Again, we're getting a total item pool here for a measure that spans kindergarten through 3rd grade. Obviously, earlier grades are going to have additional sort of exclusion criteria on them. We also excluded any words that had an adult-rated age of acquisition rating greater than 9. So we sort of triangulated 2 different data sources that suggest whether a word is known by students or not, both test-based, so students who are actually assessed, do they know them, and also an adult rating of whether students should know them. And then we looked at two different word lists that talk about word frequency, and we excluded words that were outside frequency value of 7,500. So all of the words that were left at that point were in the top 7,500 most frequently appearing words in English. And then we also we excluded a number of words that we identified that have at least one or more potentially inappropriate meanings. Obviously, we don't want students reading words that they're going to find inappropriate, but we also don't want to slow students down for that because they stumble over a word because it may make them laugh or something like that. So what we ended up with for the third grade forms was a total item pool of just over 2,000 words. And then, as I mentioned, that pool was narrowed further in terms of word knowledge and word frequency information for the pools to collect or to generate kindergarten through second grade forms. And so here's the figure that I was mentioning just a minute ago that really illustrates why we have both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency for DIBELS 8th edition. And each of the four panels that you see on this graphic represent a different grade, everything from kindergarten in the top left to third grade in the bottom right. They all show or tell essentially the same picture or the same story. I'm going to focus on the bottom left quadrant, which is second grade, because it's a little bit clearer. The trends are a little bit more obvious, but the same basic idea applies across all grades. And so what you see in each of the panels, and so I'll again draw your attention to second grade. So what you see in the bottom left panel is two dashed lines, and so each of those lines represent the benchmark, DIBELS 8th benchmark goal for one of the two measures. And because we have nonsense word fluency on the x-axis, the vertical line represents the benchmark goal for nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds. And we have word reading fluency on the y-axis, which means that the horizontal line, dashed line, represents the benchmark goal for word reading fluency, correct words. And so by drawing those two cuts, we divide the plot into four quadrants, essentially. And so each dot that you see on a plot represents an actual student that we had in our pilot study, and each dot represents their score, the relationship between their score on nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And so we've color-coded each quadrant based on which quadrant they fall into. And what you see in the top right quadrant of each plot in purple are students who are identified as on track, regardless of whether you're looking at nonsense word fluency or word reading fluency. And so those are kids that we are confident are doing fine. We could just give one measure or the other, and we would have come to the same conclusion. The same is true in the bottom left quadrant in red, where we would come to the same conclusion for these students that they're at risk, again, regardless of whether we were looking at nonsense word fluency or word reading fluency. But it's those students in each of the other two quadrants, the top left blue quadrant and the bottom right green quadrant, that represent students whose recommendation changes depending on which measure you're looking at. And so I've drawn a box around students in the green quadrant, and these are kids who, if all we gave was nonsense word fluency, we would say, oh, it looks like these kids are on track because they're doing pretty good with basic decoding skills, certainly good enough to get beyond the benchmark goal for second grade. But what we see is that when we ask them to do a sight word task, which is, again, what word reading fluency is, that they don't know enough sight words to be proficient. And so those are students who we would have missed if we just gave nonsense word fluency. But we're able to identify as needing instructional support because we've also given them word reading fluency. And the same is true of the top left quadrant, where if all we gave was word reading fluency, which of course we've never had in DIBELS before, but if we were to just give word reading fluency, those kids would look fine because their sight word vocabulary is large enough that they can get past the benchmark goal on word reading fluency. But what the nonsense word fluency scores tell us is that they're not doing a good enough job decoding to allow them to be proficient, develop into proficient readers by the time we need them to. And so those kids need additional instructional support with advanced decoding. And I should mention that these data were collected on our new measures, so it does represent the progressive difficulty and more complex spelling patterns that are represented in nonsense word fluency in DIBELS 8th edition. So it's really a good illustration, again, of why we have chosen to provide subtests for both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And when we just draw a circle around that student in the far right-hand side of the lower right-hand quadrant, because this is a kid that's really going gangbusters on decoding. Again, we would think that this kid was doing great, but again, their sight word knowledge is lacking from where we'd expect them and want them and need them to be. For oral reading fluency, the biggest change that I think is going to be most obvious to schools and teachers is that, again, based on a rigorous review of research that suggests that administering more than one ORF passage in a given administration sitting doesn't really give you a whole lot of additional information about a student's reading ability. And so, again, if we're not gaining much by doing that, we know that instructional time is valuable and limited, and assessment time is limited. So we want to, if we're not getting a lot of good information by having kids read 3 passages, which takes 3 minutes, then why not just have them read 1 passage, which takes 1 minute? And of course, for one student, 2 minutes isn't a huge difference, but you add that up over the course of a classroom or a school or a district, and you can see there's significant gains there in terms of administration time and ease of administration. The other major change that we're really proud of is that all passages that you see for oral reading fluency in DIBELS 8th edition were written by previously published authors and classroom teachers. That's important because we think that people that have experience writing stories of this type are going to write more engaging stories and stories that are more appropriate for students at a particular grade level. And we actually had all of the stories also reviewed by parents and former classroom teachers along a range of dimensions, including readability, but also engagement and appropriateness and things like that. And we found, both based on ratings and anecdotal evidence from initial data collection, that is the case, that the passages for DIBELS 8th edition are more engaging, certainly, and more grade appropriate than previous versions of DIBELS. And so, of course, we've also taken into account text complexity. That doesn't just mean readability formulas, although we do still use those, but we've also accounted for text complexity in a number of additional ways that we haven't ever seen before or done before. For the Mays measure, again, it's a similar approach to oral reading fluency. All the passages that are used for Mays were also written by published authors and classroom teachers with the same design specifications around content and structure and things like that. But we've also applied research-based passage formatting. So we looked at evidence around font size and line spacing and things like that to provide what we think is an optimal environment to minimize distractions for students and allow them to focus on the content and ultimately on the answering the questions or completing the distractor items. And we also used research to inform how we went about selecting and identifying distractor items and in how they were arranged and organized on the form themselves. So the overall takeaways in terms of our measure development process. We just want to emphasize that all of these changes were deliberate and they were all done backed by research evidence that suggests that, to our best knowledge, that we're doing the best we can, again, to minimize any construct irrelevant variation and really focus on student ability on whatever construct we're attempting to measure. And we've done that by a combination of deliberate item sampling and placement, which has resulted in forms across measures that are more comparable than ever before. And again, that really allows us to be confident that the differences that we see between one administration to the next for the same student reflect at least primarily changes in that student's knowledge rather than arbitrary or extraneous differences between the forms themselves. And the other advantage of the item development approach that we have taken for DIBELS 8th edition is that it provides data on specific skills that students have mastered. And anecdotally, in our piloting work and with work with schools this year, teachers have reported that the DIBELS 8 measures have increased their ability to use data to inform instruction, and that this is particularly true for students who are above the benchmark goal. So that's a brief overview of the innovative changes that we've made to our measures for DIBELS 8th edition. Now I want to turn our attention for just a few minutes to give you a sampling of some of the research that we've conducted on the measures themselves to ensure, again, the technical adequacy and make sure that all of the psychometric properties of the measures are as good or better than previous versions of DIBELS. So just to give you a sample of the students on which these data that I'm going to report to you were collected, for DIBELS 8, the data that I'm reporting here is based on our Year 1 sample. And I do want to emphasize as we go through that we really view this as an ongoing process. So we're continuing to collect data this year to do additional research and validation, and we're planning, and of course we'll continue to do so for the foreseeable future. But to establish a baseline for the validity and reliability of the measures, we collected data on more than 6,000 students who came from a total of 29 schools in 13 U.S. states. And we made sure that those states represented all 4 census regions so that we have coverage from every area of the country. And we also made sure that the sample that we collected represented a racially and ethnically diverse population such that it reflects closely to the distribution of students in the United States. And so the data that we're talking about today are from 2017 and 18 primarily, with a little bit from 2019. And just as a comparison, the DMG, DIBELS Next, or Acadians samples, just to give you a little bit of context, their reliability and norming data are regularly updated with a national sample from their database. But the validity evidence that they report and their goals are all based on a relatively small sample of just over 1,300 students. And it was collected nearly a decade ago now. And so, as Nancy talked about at the beginning, it's important for all academic measures, but especially for something like this, which is a formative assessment, to update that information periodically so that you know that the sample that you're describing and making and basing decisions on is representative of the students who are taking the test. And so that's another reason why we made sure that our sample was as diverse and representative as possible. And so I'm going to give you a sampling of 3 or 4 different types of reliability and validity evidence. We're not going to go through all of these numbers in detail. If you're interested in that information, you can find currently our technical brief on the DIBELS website, which Maureen will talk about in just a minute, how to access that information. And then we're also actively working to release a full technical report, which will provide even more information of this type. But just to give you a sense, sort of the big picture of how much more information we have than we've ever had before on DIBELS, and also that the information we have is as good or better than ever has been. Here is a table of alternate form reliability, comparison across each of the measures and the grades in which they're available. As you can see, in all cases, the coefficients, which these are reliability coefficients, so they range in values from theoretically from -1 to 1, practically from 0 to 1, and so higher numbers here are better. You can see in all cases, in nearly all cases, our reliability, alternate form reliability, is greater than 0.8, and in most cases it's above 0.9, which is sort of the standard that you shoot for. And it's also worth noting that the alternate form reliability that we're showing here for DIBELS 8th edition is often what's called delayed alternate form. So these aren't alternate forms that were taken at the same time or even within a few days of each other, but actually a pretty extended period. So, but reliability coefficients in this range for that time period suggests that all of our measures are reliable across forms. And again, we attribute that to a number of the innovations and revisions that we made that I just talked about in terms of ensuring that all of the forms are assessing the same kinds of information at all time points, regardless of the actual items that appear on the form. This table talks about concurrent validity. So these again are coefficients, so they're ranging again from 0 to 1 essentially. The extent to which students' performance on each of these DIBELS 8th edition measures correlates to performance on an external criterion measure. For DIBELS 8th edition in kindergarten, that external criterion is the composite score for DIBELS Next. And for all other grades, the criterion measure is the Iowa Assessment Total Reading Score. And again, we have additional coefficients and additional criterion measures collected and are available in the technical brief and technical manual, but we're not going to report all of those here. So overall, as you can see, again, similar to reliability, we are reporting validity evidence in more grades and time points and measures than we've ever reported before for DIBELS, and that on the balance across the board, that the coefficients that you're seeing are, with a couple of exceptions, phoneme segmentation fluency in first grade being the biggest one. They're all within the range that you would expect to see for this kind of validity, generally between 0.7, 0.6, 0.7. So again, more information about these specific coefficients is available in our technical brief, but the point of this slide, again, is to show that there's more evidence than we've had in the past, and that it's as good or better than the evidence that we've had in the past for DIBELS 8th edition. The other kind of evidence that we want to talk briefly about is an overall screening accuracy or classification accuracy. And what this slide does is it sort of gives you a high-level overview of what we're talking about when we talk about screening accuracy. And essentially, we are assessing students on two measures. One, some DIBELS 8 subtest, and two, what we're calling a gold standard assessment or an external criterion. And we're either doing that concurrently or in some cases, but in most cases in a delayed manner, such that they take the DIBELS 8th measures in, say, the fall or winter, and the gold standards criterion measure in the spring. And so each of the columns represent how students would perform on the gold standard assessment. So essentially, we're dichotomizing their performance, identifying a score. Well, the publisher is identifying a score that represents essentially reading difficulty or no reading difficulty, with reading difficulty being represented in the left-hand column and no reading difficulty the right. And then for each student's performance on the DIBELS 8th screening measures, we identify whether they are at risk or not at risk. And so that, again, divides scores into this 2x2 quadrant, where if DIBELS 8 says that a student is at risk, and when they take the gold standard assessment at the end of the year, it says, yep, this kid is a struggling reader, that's what we call a true positive, that, that essentially that the DIBELS 8th measure correctly predicted or agrees with the gold standard assessment. And then similarly, that's the top left quadrant, obviously. Similarly, the bottom right-hand quadrant, which are true negatives, are when both measures agree, but in the opposite direction, that the student is not at risk or does not have a reading difficulty. And the other two quadrants, the top right and the bottom left, are cases where there's a disagreement, such that that bottom left representing students that a DIBELS screening measure says doesn't have the difficulty, doesn't have reading difficulty, whereas the gold standard says that they actually do. We refer to that as a false positive. And in the top right quadrant, where the DIBELS measure identifies a student as at risk, but the outcome measure says they weren't actually at risk, we identify that as a false negative. And so we can take each of these quadrants and summarize the ratio of the number of students in each quadrant, and come up with a range of statistics that summarize how accurate the screening measure is at identifying, in this case, of course, reading difficulty. And what we'll talk about on the next slide are three statistics estimates, again, similar to a correlation coefficient, but not exactly the same, where the numbers themselves range from 0 to 1, and values closer to 1 represent better performance. We're going to talk about what we call the area under the curve, or the AUC, which is a global overall measure of how well the measure does at identifying students as being at risk and not at risk. And then we talk about sensitivity, which represents the rate of true positives, and specificity, which is the rate of true negatives. And so again, this is just a sampling of data that we have available. We have much more information available in the technical brief and upcoming technical report. But again, the major takeaway that we want to emphasize for this webinar is that in all cases where we have data, we have quite a bit more data than we've ever been able to report for DIBELS before. And that in these cases that the statistics are comparable, or in many cases better than what we've done before. So this table just looks at kindergarten and grade 1. It looks at all of the measures that are available in those grades, and shows you for two different cut scores, and the cut score for risk and the cut score for some risk. The numbers outside the parentheses are the overall classification accuracy, that's the AUC, and the numbers in the parentheses to the left of the slash are sensitivity, which are the true positives, and the numbers to the right of the slash are the specificity, which are true negatives. And what you can see, I'll just take as one example, oral reading fluency in first grade there at the bottom of the slide. The reason why you're seeing ranges here is because we're reporting this, the ranges across time points. So we're looking at this at the fall, winter, and spring. So you can see the range of scores. And so again, for the oral reading fluency in first grade, the bottom row, we can see that for the sum risk cut score, the overall classification accuracy ranges from 0.94 to 0.97. Which is similar to the value of 0.92 that we were previously reported for the DMG former goals. But again, this is slightly higher. But where you see more differences is in the sensitivity and specificity values, whereas the former goals privileged specificity, that is making sure that they weren't incorrectly identifying students as needing additional instructional support when they didn't need it. That is the statistic that they privileged, and that's why it's so high there at 0.92. We've continued to ensure that that is high here, between 0.90 and 0.97, but what you see is that the sensitivity value of 0.88 to 0.92, again for oral reading fluency in first grade, is much higher than the sensitivity value that you see for the sum risk cut score for oral reading fluency for DIBELS Next. And again, that's a value judgment, and it's something that we did intentionally, is that we chose our cut scores to balance, to maximize, but to balance both scores so that we're doing the best job we can to identify all students rather than just making sure that we catch all of the students that that are at risk for reading difficulty, or alternatively making sure that we're not serving students that don't need it. Whereas in this case we're balancing them. And so what you'll see if you look at the DIBELS Next cut scores for the former goals is that the cut scores tend to be higher because we're able to balance those two different competing statistics, but that the cut scores for DIBELS 8th are lower in most cases than the DIBELS Next recommended goals, again, because we're balancing those two statistics rather than emphasizing for sensitivity, which is what the recommended goals tended to do. So again, if you want more information about these statistics themselves, look at the technical brief or the upcoming technical manual, or reach out to customer support. But again, the idea here is that we've got more data than we ever have, and that on the balance, it's as good or better than it's ever been. Which is exactly what this next slide says. But importantly, it's not just that we have more than we've had before and that the data is stronger than it's been, but that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, we see this as an ongoing process, and that this is important. It's important to establish all of the statistical evidence that we've established to date, but that there's a lot more to do. And so we have ongoing analyses as we speak to do work to equate our benchmark forms, to improve on previous versions of the composite scores to develop an even better composite score than we ever have. We're continuing to conduct analyses to allow us to report on zones of growth, which we know that schools find to be a very important way of looking at student growth. So we'll have that for DIBELS 8th edition coming up for the next school year. We're also preparing the percentile rank data. So all of those things are ongoing analyses based on the existing data that we've already collected. But beyond that, we're actually continuing to collect data, and we have an additional validation study underway as we speak to look at some more advanced and more sophisticated ways of looking at the data, including an additional ambitious cut score for ambitious goals. We're collecting data that will allow us to estimate the reliability of the progress monitoring slopes. We're collecting additional data that will allow us to equate not just the benchmark forms, but also the progress monitoring forms. Efforts to validate the maze measures are currently underway. And as bringing it full circle, as Nancy talked about in the first few minutes of our webinar today, we are collecting additional data to allow us to validate some of our measures, including letter naming fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency, against the comprehensive test of phonological processing, to allow us to make an even stronger case for its use for those subtests' use as dyslexia screeners. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of numbers, and if you have more questions, please feel free to reach out. But we're going to pass it over now to Maureen, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the process for actually transitioning your schools and data system account to DIBELS 8th edition.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm going to share some logistical information and resources that will assist you in your transition to DIBELS 8th edition. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is our website at dibels.uoregon.edu. We have a series of web pages and downloadable documents dedicated to DIBELS 8th edition. There's an overview of DIBELS 8th edition, a section on what's new, some of the same information that Patrick shared with you earlier. It's also available in a downloadable PDF. You'll find the benchmark goals and technical reports, as well as the administration timeline that Patrick also shared with you. Finally, there's a link on the side to download the testing materials so you can get familiar with them. The DIBELS 8th edition materials were released in August 2018. This included the administration and scoring guide, a technical brief, as well as benchmark and progress monitoring student and scoring booklets. As I mentioned, the materials are available for free PDF download. We also have pre-printed version available for purchase if you prefer. We will be doing an updated release in spring 2019. This will include an updated administration and scoring guide, a full technical manual, as well as the maze materials. We'll be making some small updates to the progress monitoring and benchmark student and scoring booklets as well. Data system services are currently available for DIBELS 8th edition. If you're using the data system, you can activate it from the Manage Products menu. Students who are already rostered in your account are automatically available, and you'll have continuity on their records. Data entry for all grades and all measures is currently available, with the exception of maze. Right now, we have 22 of the 26 reports available. By the end of February, we should have all of them with the exception of zones of growth, which will come shortly afterwards. We currently have an early adopter pricing. It's $1 per student, and you'll get a 50-cent credit back on 2019 and 20 service. So it's a very economical way to try out the new measures with some students. In the 2019-2020 school year, you can activate the DIBELS 8th edition on the welcome page in your DDS account. Again, students who are already in your account can easily be migrated forward with continuous records. We'll have full data entry and reporting for all of the measures, including maze. We'll also be introducing equated scores for both ORF and maze, and adding a new composite score. We've been collaborating with our partner Amplify, who will also have tablet scoring available. Their information is at amplify.com. Obviously, planning your budget is going to be very important as well, so I wanted to share some information about pricing with you. Because we're a nonprofit university, our goal is always to provide the most cost-efficient services to schools that we can. So we are continuing to offer all the new features and improvements of DIBELS 8th edition at the same $1 price. For those looking for more cost savings, we are also going to have 2- and 3-year options available that will average out to either 75 cents per student or 70 cents per student per year. And we understand that moving to a new version of DIBELS can take some planning time, so we have a 2-year transition in place. During the 2018-19 school year and 2019-20 school year, we are supporting DIBELS 6th edition, DIBELS Next, and DIBELS 8th edition. Starting in the 2020-2021 year, we will be switching our support to focus only on DIBELS 8th edition. All of the historical data from your account will still be available for you to run at that point, as well as report access for all prior years and versions, again with continuous records for your students, so you'll still be able to access that information. And if you're new to the data system, we do offer free import of data from past years from other systems, in which case you would also be able to access all of the report and student information and data from prior years and prior versions. So I know that's been a lot of information that we've covered today. So I wanted to make sure you know about our wonderful customer support team. Please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions. You can email or call us at the hours listed here. And now I'll turn it back over to Nancy to provide some information about training.
Thanks, Maureen. If you're interested in getting training to administer DIBELS 8th edition measures, we are currently working with training groups to build their capacity to train schools across the country. We're also developing an online training course for release in spring 2019 so that if you want to receive training online, you would be able to pursue that option. We're currently also planning for regional and local training events across the country. So if you are interested in any of those options, you should contact us. You can do that by contacting customer support or by responding to our survey link. And we've received some questions from some of you, so we're gonna go ahead and address those questions now. The first question here is about training, the time commitment and the cost for training in particular. So the time commitment for training is currently planned to be 2 days to be trained to administer DIBELS 8th edition if you're wanting a live in-person training. We will be rolling out a trainer of trainers model later this spring and summer as well, which would be an additional 2 days of training. The cost for training is still in development. So if you are interested in training and interested in more information about the cost for training, I do recommend that you fill out the survey or contact customer support. There's another question here also about former goals and recommended goals and whether those will still exist with the new edition of DIBELS 8th edition. There will not be former goals and recommended goals with DIBELS 8th edition for one primary reason, and that is that we've extensively studied the DIBELS 8th edition measure using a large sample, as Patrick described earlier, that is representative of all of the 4 census regions across the country. The technical adequacy evidence behind DIBELS 8th edition is such that the recommended goals are no longer needed and the former goals will not apply. So you'll see one consistent set of benchmark goals for DIBELS 8th edition. And again, the former goals exist. The former goals and the recommended goals really existed because the former goals were developed with a very limited, constrained sample that was not representative of all of the students that typically are administered DIBELS measures. And the recommended goals were a way to address that limited sample size. And so that's why CTL had those recommended goals in the past for previous editions of DIBELS. But going forward, there will not be former goals or recommended goals with DIBELS 8th edition.
We've received a question about norms and percentiles. We do have the technical information available for those now, and we will be working on making those available on reports in the DIBELS data system for the 2019-20 school year.
We've also gotten a few questions about the benchmark goals, the first of which just asks what changes, if any, there have been to the benchmark goals. And so as we talked about a little bit briefly, but I wanted to emphasize here, one of our primary objectives when developing the benchmark goals for DIBELS 8th edition was to do our best to balance these two competing needs to identify those students who are at risk, but also not over-identify students who are not at risk. And so what you'll see is if you compare the DIBELS 8th edition benchmark goals to either the former or recommended benchmark goals for DIBELS Next, is that they fall somewhere in the middle. And the reason for that is, again, because of how we've prioritized those two different statistics. We've done our best to allow us to identify correctly those students who actually need support without identifying students who end up not needing support as actually needing to be intervened with. And we've got a related question here about why the benchmark scores for DIBELS 8th edition have decreased. And again, it's a function of that trade-off that we made in terms of where we set the benchmark goals. So again, the reason for that is just because we wanted to prioritize making the best overall decision that we could across students of all ability levels, rather than overemphasizing one type of student over the other. We have a question here about student growth percentiles, whether we have any reports or will have any reports for DIBELS 8th edition that provide student growth percentiles. That's an easy one. The answer is yes. It'll be very similar to the existing zones of growth report, and we will have a version of that available for DIBELS 8th edition measures as well. We have a question about the benchmark goals for PSF specifically. Whereas previous editions of DIBELS didn't offer recommended benchmark goals at all time points, DIBELS 8th edition does. And the reason for that is because traditionally, PSF has not been a particularly strong predictor or indicator of overall reading performance. So earlier editions of DIBELS only provided benchmark goals where the measure did an above average job of predicting overall performance. Of course, PSF does provide instructionally relevant information for students at a particular developmental phase, and so despite those limitations that we've always seen with PSF, we decided for DIBELS 8th edition to go ahead and calculate and report recommended benchmark goals for all time periods in which subtests are offered. And that's actually true of all subtests, not just PSF. But the important thing to keep in mind as you're looking at these benchmark goals is that when you're making instructional decisions about students' needs, student progress towards a given goal really needs to be considered in the context of their performance across all of the available measures. And that's particularly true in the early grades and particularly true of PSF as well. So to summarize, we've decided to provide recommended benchmark goals anytime that we're offering a measure. And it's important as you're looking at those goals to think about where students fall and what they look like across the whole range of measures rather than just looking at one single measure. We also have a question about word reading fluency in kindergarten. I mentioned earlier that in a lot of cases, students at the beginning of the year don't have the skills to perform well on this subtest. And so we have a question about what the benchmark expectations for the beginning of the year on word reading fluency will be. And again, as I just mentioned with PSF, we are reporting recommended benchmark goals for all time periods for every subtest. And of course, at the beginning of kindergarten, where word reading knowledge is fairly limited for a lot of students, those goals are low, actually, as you'll see. And in those cases where students aren't able to perform well on word reading fluency, other subtests will provide more instructionally relevant information for those students. And in addition, we have new cross-measure discontinue rules that help minimize the assessment burden so that those students who actually can't perform on the earlier subtests aren't even actually asked to take WRF. So again, the expectation is essentially whether they can do the task or not, and we have a number of tools to help you more efficiently assess students and determine whether they need to take that test or not.
Great. Thanks, Patrick, for answering those questions. And thanks, everyone, for submitting those questions. If you do have additional questions, you can contact customer support to get those answered. We're going to go ahead and wrap up today, but we want to thank you for joining us and for your interest in DIBELS 8th edition.